I greet you, ladies and gentlemen, even as I start the presentation of our module on research methodology. Today, we want to examine the structure of three chapters. The structure of three chapters, or rather, the structures of three chapters, or how three chapters are structured, namely literature review, research methodology, and data analysis. I hope the lecture will not be long. In a subsequent lecture, I may demonstrate the structures of these three chapters with some case studies so that we can examine the do's and don'ts of those three chapters. So look at the chapter that we have been dwelling on for quite some time, for which I've made a number of presentations. The chapter in question is the literature review chapter. According to many in the empirical literature, the literature review chapter has got basically three parts. It has basically three parts. In other words, it has three main parts. The first part is the introduction, which sort of introduces us to the main issues that are covered under literature review. These are theoretical and empirical issues. And then the second part of literature review is the body, which is the longest part of literature review with quite a number of parts. And then the last part of literature review is the conclusion of that chapter, which is also called the chapter summary. So we'll start with the introduction of literature review. As the term indicates, or as the term shows, with the introduction of literature review, the student or the scholar who is writing the literature review chapter introduces us to the main issues that are covered in their literature review chapter. These main issues that are covered in their literature review chapter may be the main subsections that make up their literature review, like the key concepts, the key theories, the conceptual framework, just in brief, the empirical evidence that has been covered. Maybe if the researcher has got 2 or 3 case studies, they can be briefly mentioned in the introduction. As a rule of thumb, the introduction can have at most 2 paragraphs, but we normally encourage students to just write 1 concise paragraph so that they don't delve into the issues that are supposed to be either introduced, explained, or discussed within the body under the introduction. As the word introduction actually indicates to us, the purpose of the introductory section of your literature review is to introduce, not to explain anything, not to discuss any issues. So ordinarily, we don't expect any student or scholar to be citing any researchers under introduction, because it would imply that the student or the scholar is now actually explaining conceptual issues, is now delving into conceptual issues, or is now delving into the discussion, which is supposed to be tackled under the body. And then the next part is the body, which is the longest part of literature review, or the core, the substance of literature review. Under the body, there may be various styles of coming up with the body of literature review, but what I will give is just a generic outline of literature review. Under the body, the first part is normally definition of terms. If we don't have definition of key terms, the researcher would explain key concepts, and explanations are not necessarily definitions. explanations can be of a theoretical nature, or explanations can be just basic without any presentation of theories, unless if the issues that are being explained are actually theories. So the theory-based explanations, they can't be avoided in that case. So the first part is the definition of key terms. The definition of key terms, or the explanation of key terms and concepts, is very important because it enables the researcher to delimit the scope of their study. When we see their working definitions, or when we see their school of thought from how they define key concepts, relying on the literature, we're able to know the scope of whatever they are studying, what is within the scope of whatever is being studied, and what is without or outside the scope of whatever is being studied. After key concepts have been explained or defined, the researcher moves on to the next part, where theories are traced. If the research problem has got one main or two main theories, it is at this stage, after the definition of key concepts or key terms, that theories are actually traced from their background or from their origins and discussed. The tracing of the theories from their origin is not too elaborate or very exhaustive, but just the essential elements are covered, because there's a lot to cover under literature review. So in the presentation of theories, the scholar or the student may briefly mention the relationships that are expected to obtain between variables, but the student does not delve deeper into those relationships, because there's a research methodology chapter where such relationships, if they are mathematical, are actually covered under the methodological review of the literature. The methodological review of the literature is done under research methodology. So the coverage of theories generally avoids presenting equations and a host of other relationships, unless there is a compelling reason for presenting equations and other mathematical relationships under literature review. The general format that is adopted under literature review is to adopt the tabular or the graphical approach in presenting relationships between variables. Besides the tabular or graphical approach, some scholars or some researchers, they also use the flowchart approach, where they'll be having a series of boxes or circles or pie charts where relationships are established between variables by use of arrows, either just a feed forward or feedback, or a combination of feed forward and feedback arrows to show, unidirectional or bidirectional relationships between variables. So theories are developed, and once theories are traced and developed, the last part in the presentation of each and every theory must be the discussion of that theory in the light of the literature which is discussing that theory. The literature on both extremes, you'll discover that for any given theory, there will be scholars on one extreme and scholars on the other extreme. Scholars on both extremes, they have to be reconciled, or the divergence between two sets of scholars must be rationalized under the discussion of the theory or theories. And then the third part, after theories have been discussed, is to come up with a conceptual framework. Some students, they think once you have discussed the theories, you have actually come up with a conceptual framework. No, that's not the case. A conceptual framework has got two parts. The first part is the discussion of the assumptions that underpin key concepts. It's very imperative under literature review that the student or the scholar presents to us the assumptions, and they rationalize them using the theoretical literature. The assumptions, they present to us the assumptions according to the extant literature of a theoretical nature. so that we are able to delimit the scope of the study by knowing its assumptions. The assumptions, they tell us how far we can go in testing relationships or experimenting on relationships between or among variables. If assumptions are missing, it means the conceptual framework is incomplete. And the other part of the conceptual framework is the outline of the basics of the concepts. The outline of the basics of the concept is where relationships are actually developed between variables, key variables that impinge on a research topic. And then the conceptual framework has to be discussed. First, you give us the assumptions that underpin key concepts. On your way to outlining basic concepts or outlining the conceptual framework of a study. And then once we have been given the assumptions and the outline of the conceptual framework, a discussion is engaged in by the writer of literature review or the compiler of literature review. And the discussion is by way of literature. You realize that when you are coming up with a conceptual framework, let us assume you adopt the middle ground. Still, there will be scholars on either of the two extremes or on both ends of the spectrum. So you try to discuss if scholars on a particular issue are generally agreed, and there are few or no peripheral scholars or outlier scholars, so to speak. It becomes imperative for whoever is compiling literature review under the discussion to show us the convergence among different scholars. Because it may occur that for certain concepts, there are no controversies. Scholars are generally converging on a certain perspective. The fourth part of literature review under the board, because the board has got 4 main parts, is empirical evidence. Empirical evidence has got 4 parts. I mean, not 4 parts as such, but it can adopt 4 approaches, empirical evidence. With empirical evidence now, you are testing the conceptual framework or the relationships between your variables that you discussed under the conceptual framework. You are now testing these relationships, not really you testing them, but presenting the findings of other people, and they were testing those variables to set the stage for your chapter 3, your research methodology. And the crafting of the empirical evidence chapter, I mean the empirical evidence section of your literature review, may follow any one of the following 4 approaches. First, it can be theme-based or it can be thematic. You can use specific themes to actually craft your empirical evidence. Let us assume you're engaged in a study of electronic banking. In that study of electronic banking, you may decide, I'll look at cards on their own, review all the evidence on cards, go to mobile banking, review all the evidence on mobile banking, go to telephone banking or landline-based banking, if there is such a type of banking. I believe it is there. Review all the evidence on that. But generally, you gather you discuss all the empirical evidence which is related to a certain theme, a specific theme. Let us assume you are looking at poverty alleviation. It's a start on poverty alleviation. There is poverty alleviation through infrastructural development within a country, infrastructural development programs. There is poverty alleviation through deficit spending. There is poverty alleviation through humanitarian and other development initiatives, either bankrolled by the government of a particular country or bankrolled by donor aid. So all of those themes of poverty alleviation, each and every one of them will be having a case study or some case studies that fit under that theme. And then the second approach that is normally taken by researchers in crafting up empirical evidence is the case study approach. That is the easiest and the most easy to to actually follow, the easiest to follow. The case study approach, it might be a case study of a bank or a case study of a country on a particular research topic. Say mobile banking in Zimbabwe, mobile banking in Masvingo province, or mobile banking in Mpumalanga province in South Africa, or mobile banking in Nairobi County if you are investigating mobile banking in Kenya, for instance. But generally, case study, it has to be either a case study of an entity, as in, say, Econet or Vodacom, or any one of the companies that you'll be interested in doing a case study on. Or it may be a case study of a place, either a case study of an entity, an organization or a company, or an institution, or a case study of a place. It might be a town, a city, a suburb, and so on. Generally, you cover all the empirical evidence on that place. And then C is a time-based or chronological kind of empirical evidence, where empirical evidence related to a certain period is reviewed all at once from different scholars. This is especially true for time series or longitudinal studies, studies which are sensitive to time, where the research topic specifies time. If the research topic specifies a time period, then a scholar or a compiler of literature review, of the literature review chapter, may decide to come up with a time-based or a chronological empirical evidence section of their literature review. Some scholars who are seasoned in writing, research articles, they may choose a hybrid of the approaches to empirical evidence. They might underpin a case study approach with a theme, with certain themes. A case study approach might be thematic underneath, or a thematic approach to empirical evidence might have one or two case studies to clarify certain issues. So, and then the hybrid method, it might be that you are adopting a thematic-based approach, but you realize that your study is based on South Africa. So there's need for focused literature review, where you are reviewing empirical evidence on South Africa, which is the focus of your study, in order to come up with what is known as focused literature review. In that case, you will be forced to review empirical evidence or the findings and the conclusions of other researchers on your focus of study, which is South Africa, or on your focus of study, which is the Commercial Bank of Zimbabwe, or CPZ, or your focus of study, which is the New York Stock Exchange. You may want to see how other scholars concluded on the New York Stock Exchange. And as a result, you may feel that, yes, I adopted a thematic approach in reviewing empirical evidence in general, but I need to do focused literature review so that I've got, a portion of literature review which I will be able to juxtapose with my findings and my research conclusions, so that my findings and my research conclusions, they reflect back to the literature, or they refer back to the literature, to either create a convergence or a divergence or both, in order to bridge the knowledge gap, or to either extend the boundaries of knowledge, whatever the case may be. And then after the scholar or the student is done with the empirical evidence section of their literature review, including focused literature review, if the study mentions a country or an entity or a place or a geographical region like the European Union or BRICS, after the student has done focused literature review, they then conclude their literature review chapter. They must tell us certain conclusions that flow from theoretical evidence that they were actually discussing under the first part of the report, and also the empirical evidence. And before they they move on to the next chapter, there must be a sentence which is sort of helping us to transition from literature review to chapter 3, which will be telling us that this chapter, which will be telling us that the next chapter will cover research methodology issues. It may mention some of those research methodology issues like research design, the research philosophy, the key variables, the population of stat, and so on. Sometimes it's not even necessary to mention the key components because those key components will then be mentioned under the introduction of the research methodology chapter. So I believe with this I've covered the key elements of the structure of literature review. So once more, by way of conclusion, and as a summary to what I've just covered, the literature review chapter has got 3 major parts. It has got the head, the body, and the feet. I know the head is part of the human body, and the feet are part of the human body. But I'm just giving an analogy, an example in terms of the human body, the head, the feet, and the rest of the body, which is in between the feet and the head. So what am I saying? The head is your introduction, the feet is your conclusion or your chapter summary. And then the body, which is the bulk of what a human being actually is in terms of their anatomy, comprises of, number 1, definition of key terms and or key concepts. Number 2, a tracing of theories and their discussion. Number 3, the conceptual framework. Part A, the discussion of assumptions that underpin key concepts that are linked to the topic or that impinge on the research topic. Part 3, Part B, the outline of the basic concepts or the conceptual framework. So we advance from the assumption to the outline where we are linking now variables, and we are explaining those linkages, not in our own words, but in terms of using the literature out there, which has come up with the conceptual framework of the people who started that phenomenon before us. 3, Part C, is the discussion of the conceptual framework. If there are controversies that are associated with the conceptual framework, it is discussed. And then the last part of the body is empirical evidence. And empirical evidence may be theme-based or thematic. It may be case study-based. And by case study-based, it might be a case study of an entity, an institution, a company, or just an organization. Or it might be a case study of a place. Or it might be a case study of a combination of both. A case study of a place and an institution. Because some institutions, they exist only in a certain place or in certain places. Or they operate in a certain place or in certain places. And then the third approach to empirical evidence, it might be time-based or chronological, especially for those studies which are longitudinal or time series kind of case studies. It may not be wise to compare results of econometric studies that were done under different time periods because economic conditions change and assumptions may not hold which were prevailing in a certain dispensation or time period. A case in point is a person who studies the relationship between gross investment and economic growth in Zimbabwe between 1980 and 1990. And another person who decides to study the relationship between economic growth in Zimbabwe and between economic growth and investment in Zimbabwe between 2000 and 2010. In the two time periods, you have got the dispensation of socialism, and then you have got the dispensation of quasi-fiscal activities between 2000 and 2010. And then beyond 2010, you have got the multi-currency dispensation from 2009. And between 2000 and 2010, there are actually many dispensations there. There is the quasi-fiscal activities towards the end of towards 2010, from 2009 to 2010 and beyond. There is the multi-currency dispensation, which was briefly disrupted by the bond note, period or situation. So now it makes a lot of sense when you are undertaking a time series kind of study to compare empirical evidence of the roughly the same period, so that you don't end up generating wrong conclusions from your review of empirical evidence. And then, writers who are sophisticated or experienced in undertaking research, they normally adopt a hybrid. In my presentation, before this summary, I explained that a case study may be underpinned by specific themes, or a specific theme might be having one or two case studies to clarify those themes. And then empirical evidence will be presented accordingly. And then I also highlighted that for many studies which have got countries as part of the topic, or economic blocks as part of the topic, like your SADC or your BRICS or your EU, in that case, if you adopt the thematic approach, it's still necessary for you to do a focused literature review or on the focus of your study, which is either BRICS countries or SADC countries or ECOWAS or COMESA or whatever, ASEAN or whatever economic bloc you choose, or whatever group of countries you choose. And the final part of our literature review, under the structure of literature review, it is the chapter summary or the conclusion. I believe with this brief presentation, you have benefited. In the next lecture, I'm going to cover the structure of research methodology, which is just a sequel of this presentation. Thank you so much for listening in. Remember to subscribe to my channel and also to disseminate this information to your colleagues who may be undertaking research, and also to disseminate this information to other people who may be undertaking either their undergraduate studies or their graduate studies, whom you feel may benefit from this presentation, or just to fellow scholars who may be enriched by this brief presentation of the structure of the literature review chapter. Thank you so much. Have a good day.